What happens when the most protected man in the church is also its greatest monster? Not a hypothetical, not a thought experiment, a question with a name attached to it, a name spoken in the corridors of the Vatican with reverence, printed in Catholic newspapers across America with admiration, whispered by mothers who sent their sons to follow him, certain, absolutely certain, that they were placing them in the hands of a saint. The name was Marcial Maciel Degollado. He founded the Legionaries of Christ in 1941 in Mexico City, and for 6 decades, he built one of the most efficient, most admired, most generously funded religious orders in the Catholic Church. He was received by popes. He was praised by cardinals. He was called, by John Paul II himself, an efficacious guide to youth. He built seminaries. He built universities. He built a network of influence that stretched from Mexico City to Rome to the American Midwest, a cathedral of power constructed with the donations of wealthy families who believed they were investing in the kingdom of God. He was also a serial predator, a drug addict, a man who fathered at least 2 children by different women while living as a consecrated priest, a man who sexually abused seminarians for decades, some of them children, and who abused at least one of his own sons. He died in January 2008 in Jacksonville, Florida, surrounded by members of his order, having received the last rites of the church. He was never charged with a crime by the Vatican. He was never put on trial. He was never excommunicated. He was asked, 2 years before his death, to step back from public ministry and spend his remaining time in prayer and penitence. That was the punishment for 60 years of documented abuse, prayer and penitence. The question is not whether Maciel was a monster. The evidence settled that long ago. The question is how a monster becomes protected, how complaints filed with the Vatican in the 1950s, in the 1970s, in the 1990s, how all of them were buried. How 9 men who had been boys in his seminaries stood before the church in 1998 and named what had been done to them, and were met with a silence that lasted 7 more years. The question is, who built the walls around him, and why it was so easy to do? This is not a story about one man's sins. It is a story about a system that made those sins possible, profitable, and, for an extraordinarily long time, invisible. It is a story about what happens when an institution values its own reputation above the safety of children. And it is a story told, in part, through the experience of a young man from the American Midwest who arrived at a legionary seminary in 1982, believing with his whole heart that he was answering a call from God. His name, in this telling, is Thomas. He is a composite of documented testimonies. His story is their story. Thomas grew up in a household where faith was not decoration. In Davenport, Iowa, in the 1970s, the rhythms of the Catholic Church organized the week the way weather organized the seasons, with authority, with consequence, with the assumption that this was simply how things were. His mother lit candles at the parish on the first Friday of every month. His father served as an usher at the 7 o'clock Mass. There were 5 children. Thomas was the eldest, and from the time he was 12, the parish priest had told his parents, gently, then with increasing confidence, that the boy had something, a seriousness, a depth of attention during the liturgy that most boys his age spent in distraction. He had considered the diocesan seminary, the thought of staying close, remaining in Iowa, becoming a priest of the diocese he had grown up in, had a certain humble appeal. But in the spring of 1982, at a vocations retreat in Chicago, he heard a presentation by a Legionary of Christ recruiter, a young, well-dressed, articulate priest named Father Rinaldo, and something shifted. The Legionaries, Father Rinaldo explained, were different. They were rigorous. They were orthodox at a time when orthodoxy was becoming rare. They were international. The order had seminaries in Rome, in Spain, in Mexico. They were growing. They were on fire. And their founder, Father Maciel, was a living example of what consecrated life could be. A man of extraordinary prayer, extraordinary energy, extraordinary vision. Thomas was 19 years old. He had never heard a priest speak with that kind of certainty. He applied to the Legionary Seminary in Connecticut in the fall of 1982. He was accepted. His mother cried at the airport. Tears of grief, yes, but also of pride. Her son was going to become a soldier of Christ. The thought was enough to make the separation bearable. The seminary was unlike anything Thomas had imagined. It was clean, almost austere in its precision. The schedule was fixed: prayer, study, manual labor, silence, meals taken in common, letters home monitored by superiors before being sent. The discipline was explained, always, as formation. You were not losing freedom. You were learning to give it willingly, as a spiritual offering. In the first months, Thomas found it clarifying. The noise of the outside world, the choices, the distraction, the negotiation, all of it fell away. There was something clean about knowing exactly where you were supposed to be at every hour of the day. He met Father Maciel for the first time in the spring of 1983. The founder was visiting from Rome. The seminarians were assembled in the chapel. Thomas had expected gravity. He had not expected charm. Maciel was a compact man, precise in his movements, with dark eyes that seemed, impossibly, to focus entirely on whoever he was speaking to. He moved through the assembled seminarians with the ease of a man who had never in his life felt awkward in a room. He asked questions, genuine questions, or what felt like genuine questions. He remembered names. He laughed at the right moments. He had the gift, so rarely seen in figures of authority, of making you feel that you were the most important person in the room. After the assembly, Thomas was one of a small group invited to meet with the founder privately. He sat across from Maciel in a small receiving room and felt, for the first time, that he was being truly seen. Asked about his vocation, not in the perfunctory way of an administrator checking a form, but with what seemed like genuine curiosity. What had led him here, what he was afraid of, what he believed God wanted from him. Thomas told him things he had not told anyone, doubts he had not confessed to his spiritual director, fears about whether he was truly worthy of the life he was pursuing. Maciel listened. He nodded. He leaned forward in his chair, and then he placed his hand on Thomas's arm and said something that Thomas would remember for decades. Not as comfort, eventually, but as the first note of a very long deception. He said, "God does not call those who are worthy. He calls those who are willing." Thomas returned to his room that night feeling, for the first time since arriving at the seminary, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He was 20 years old. He did not yet know what he had walked into. The first irregularities were small enough to explain away a rule that seemed strange, that seminarians were not to form particular friendships, a phrase whose breadth was never precisely defined, but whose enforcement was precise enough. Conversations between seminarians that ran too long or too personally were interrupted. Letters home were monitored. Questions about the outside world were discouraged, not through prohibition exactly, but through the gentle, persistent suggestion that too much attachment to what lay beyond the seminary walls was a sign of insufficient surrender. Thomas noticed these things. He filed them under discipline I do not yet understand. The formation system was designed, he understood, to produce a specific kind of priest, and specific formation required specific constraints. He had chosen this. He had been warned it would be demanding. The discomfort, he told himself, was the point. The night Father Maciel summoned Thomas to his private quarters for the first time, Thomas did not feel fear. He felt honored. The founder did not call every seminarian. Being called meant something. What happened in that room took Thomas years to name, not because the acts themselves were ambiguous, they were not, but because the framework surrounding them had been constructed with such patience and precision that the language of violation felt, in the moment, like a category error. Maciel spoke, before and after, in the vocabulary of trust, of spiritual intimacy, of the bond between a father and a son in Christ. He mentioned his health. He mentioned the particular burdens of leadership. He positioned what he was asking, not as desire, but as need. And he positioned Thomas's compliance not as submission, but as an act of charity toward a suffering man. Thomas left the room in silence. He did not speak of it that night. He did not speak of it for many years. This was not an accident. The architecture of silence inside the legionaries was constructed as carefully as the architecture of its buildings. Seminarians were taught that loyalty to the order, and specifically loyalty to Father Maciel, was itself a spiritual virtue. Speaking ill of a superior was framed not merely as disobedience, but as a kind of sacrilege, a wound to the body of Christ. The concept of manifestation of conscience, the practice of revealing one's inner life to superiors, created a system in which information flowed upward, but never laterally. You could not speak to a fellow seminarian about your doubts or your wounds without those words potentially reaching someone above you. And there was something else. Maciel had, over decades, created a cult of personality so thoroughly embedded in the order's identity that to question him was, in a very real sense, to question the ground beneath your own vocation. Thomas had built his life around this choice. His family had sacrificed for it. His mother's pride, his father's approval, all of it was rooted in the story that Thomas was becoming a priest under the guidance of a holy man. To admit what had happened in that room was not merely to accuse Maciel, it was to unmake everything. So Thomas stayed. He completed his studies. He was ordained. He served as a legionary priest for 11 years, through the 1980s and into the 1990s, in postings in Connecticut, in New York, in Rome. He said Mass, he administered the sacraments, he worked, and all the while he carried it. The way you carry something you have no name for, the way you learn to walk with a weight that has become so familiar you can almost forget it is not supposed to be there. He was not the only one carrying it. By the late 1990s, across 3 continents, former legionaries were beginning, slowly, painfully, at great personal cost, to speak. In Mexico, men who had entered the order as boys in the 1940s and 1950s had been speaking for years, only to find their testimonies suppressed, their characters attacked, their motives questioned by legionary communications offices that operated with the efficiency of a political campaign. Maciel's defenders, and there were many of them, positioned throughout the church, including in the Roman Curia, had a standard response to every accusation. The accusers were bitter, they were manipulative, they were enemies of a good man and a holy work. The Vatican had received complaints about Maciel as early as 1956. A formal process had been opened and then closed. The reasons for that closure were never fully disclosed. In 1978, another set of complaints reached Rome. They were not pursued. In 1998, 9 former legionaries, men who had been seminarians under Maciel across several decades, filed a formal canonical complaint with the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. They were represented by a canon lawyer. They provided names, dates, and detailed testimonies. The complaint was specific. The evidence was substantial. The canonical complaint did not disappear. It did something in some ways more corrosive. It was received, acknowledged, and then placed in a drawer. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, then headed by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, did not act on it. The reasons cited, when reasons were eventually given, involved procedural complexity and the advanced age of the alleged victims. A person reading about this today might ask a simple question. Why? The answer has several layers. The first is institutional. The Legionaries of Christ were, by 1998, one of the most financially productive religious orders in the Church. They ran schools and universities across Latin America, the United States, and Europe. Their fundraising operation, built over decades by Maciel personally through a network of wealthy families who had been cultivated with extraordinary skill, generated tens of millions of dollars annually. In Rome, the order had a significant presence and significant allies. A thorough investigation of Maciel was not merely a moral proceeding, it was, in institutional terms, an economic and political event, with consequences that many men in positions of power had strong reasons to avoid. The second layer is personal. Maciel had spent 50 years building relationships with powerful men inside the church. He had donated to their projects, supported their causes, attended their events, and presented himself, always, as a man of exceptional piety. exceptional productivity, and exceptional loyalty to the Holy See. He knew how to make himself useful. He knew how to make himself indispensable. The men who would have had to authorize an investigation of him were, many of them, men he had cultivated personally. The third layer is the one that most defies clean explanation. It has to do with the particular phenomenon of charismatic authority, the way a certain kind of person can exist for those around him in a category that simply does not permit certain accusations to adhere. Maciel had constructed over a lifetime an image of such evident holiness, such evident fruitfulness, such evident sacrifice, that the testimonies of his victims were processed by those who encountered them as incompatible with the person they believed they knew. Not evidence to be weighed, an impossibility to be refuted. That same year, 1998, Pope John Paul II honored Maciel publicly at a ceremony in Rome, praising his work and his fruitfulness as a founder. Thomas learned about the canonical complaint through a former legionary priest he had reconnected with after leaving the order in 1994. He had left quietly, without explanation, returning to Iowa, where he worked for 3 years at a distribution warehouse, before eventually finding his way back to practicing his faith in a small diocesan parish. When he read the testimonies, 9 men in detail, describing what had been done to them, he did not feel vindicated. He felt something closer to the vertiginous disorientation of a man who has been telling himself for years that he imagined something and who is suddenly confronted with documented evidence that he did not. In 2002, the Hartford Courant published an investigation into Maciel and the Legionaries. The National Catholic Reporter followed. The journalist Jason Berry, who had spent years investigating clerical sexual abuse in America, published detailed reporting on the 1998 canonical complaint and its suppression. The coverage was thorough. The evidence was public. John Paul II, visibly declining, didn't act. The Vatican didn't act. The Legionaries of Christ issued a statement calling the accusations an operation of slander and defamation orchestrated by enemies of the Church. The mechanism of protection did not require active conspiracy. It required only the passive operation of systems already in place, systems designed to protect the institution, to maintain the confidence of donors, to insulate leaders from accountability, and to reframe every accusation as an attack that required defense rather than an allegation that required investigation. Thomas read the newspaper accounts in his apartment in Davenport. He put the paper down. He sat with his hands in his lap for a very long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the journalist who had written the story. He was not ready to use his name. He was ready to talk. John Paul II died in April 2005. He was mourned across the world with a depth of genuine grief that attested to the real spiritual impact of his pontificate. He was beatified 6 years later, in 2011, in a ceremony attended by more than 1 million people in St. Peter's Square. The investigation of Marcial Maciel began, officially, 4 months after John Paul II's death. The new Pope, Benedict XVI, the Cardinal Ratzinger, who had presided over the congregation that allowed the 1998 complaint to sit without action, authorized a process that concluded in 2006. Maciel was not put on trial. He was not subjected to formal canonical criminal proceedings. He was not stripped of his priesthood. He was invited, the word used in the Vatican's official announcement, to withdraw to a reserved life of prayer and penitence. The communiqué expressed consideration for the feelings of the victims. It noted that Maciel's advanced age and declining health had been weighed in the decision. The Legionaries of Christ accepted the ruling and continued to operate their schools, their seminaries, their fundraising networks, their media organizations. Maciel spent his final years in Florida, not in a monastery or a retreat house, but in a private residence, attended by companions from his order. He died on January 30th, 2008. He received the last rites of the Church. He was 87 years old. The investigation that followed his death, conducted internally by the Legionaries and eventually assisted by a papal delegate appointed by Benedict XVI, revealed dimensions of concealment that even many of his victims had not fully known. Maciel had fathered children by at least 2 different women while living as a vowed celibate. One of those children, a son named Raul, gave testimony that his father had sexually abused him as well. Maciel had funded his double life, in part, with money given to him personally by the devout families who had trusted him as a man of God. The Legionaries of Christ issued a formal statement in 2010 acknowledging that their founder had led a life of reprehensible conduct. The order did not dissolve. It underwent a period of refoundation under Vatican supervision. It continued to operate. Thomas gave his account to journalists and eventually to investigators connected to the Vatican review process. He did not seek publicity. He has said, in subsequent years, that the hardest part was not the act of speaking. It was the years before speaking, the decade-long work of convincing himself that silence was a form of fidelity rather than what it actually was. A gift to the man who had harmed him, a wall around a monster. Here is what the record shows. The Vatican received the first credible complaints about Marcial Maciel in 1956. It took 50 years for the institution to act, and when it acted, it did not prosecute. It retired him. He died with his sacraments intact. His order continued without interruption. 9 documented victims filed a formal canonical complaint in 1998. It sat without action for 7 years. That same year it was filed. The reigning pope honored Maciel publicly in Rome. At least one of Maciel's own biological children was among his victims. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which received and sat on the 1998 complaint, was headed by the man who later became pope. No bishop was removed for his role in maintaining the silence. No curial official faced any formal accountability. The financial networks built by Maciel continued to operate under the same organizational structure he had created. The total number of victims cannot be determined. The 9 who filed in 1998 were only those willing, at that moment, to come forward formally. Reporting in the years following Maciel's death documented dozens of additional testimonies. Some victims were adults when the abuse began. Many were children. Many had entered the Legionaries, seeking exactly what Thomas had sought: structure, mission, a father in faith. They found Marcial Maciel. This is not a story about one bad priest who slipped through the cracks. The cracks do not explain a failure measured in decades, across multiple pontificates, on multiple continents, with documentary evidence sufficient to act on available to Rome at every stage. This is a story about a system that made a choice, not once, but dozens of times, by dozens of men in positions of institutional authority, to protect itself rather than the children inside it. The case is closed. Maciel is dead. The record is permanent. No one was ever punished. The investigation is over. The facts are not. The events depicted in this video are based on documented historical record. The protagonist, Thomas, is a composite character drawn from the formal testimonies of multiple former legionary seminarians and priests who have spoken publicly or provided accounts to investigators and journalists. All facts regarding Marcial Maciel Degolato, the Legionaries of Christ, and the institutional response of the Vatican are drawn from public records, canonical proceedings, court documents, and the investigative reporting of Jason Berry, the Hartford Courant, the National Catholic Reporter, and other verified sources. This video contains imagery generated by artificial intelligence for illustrative purposes. The names and identifying details of real victims have been protected.